Can I first of all ask you your reaction to what you just heard our correspondent say about better, effectively what the prosecutor said, better late than never? Is that your view?
I think it depends largely who you are and how you see this. I mean, I think for victims groups, better late than never is indeed sort of the theme of the day. But it's also that for some of them, they haven't been able to move on. So it may seem like 17 years to some of us, but to them, this all feels very fresh and very new because, of course, there hasn't been any legal accountability or any accountability, political either, for the events for which Mr. Kosheib is now facing trial. So I think it is that, the time element of this depends largely on who you are and how you are affected.
And when you look at the Darfur genocide, is Ali Kosheib a kingpin or a low-hanging fruit, if you will?
Well, he is not actually himself indicted under genocide. He's indicted under war crimes and crimes against humanity. And he's described as a leader, but by no means, of course, the person with whom the buck stops. That very much is Omar al-Bashir. And it will, I think, having any kind of way to reach Omar al-Bashir and bring him into The Hague will have massive impact for the broader sense of accountability that people feel. But in the meantime, of course, Mr. Kosheib's defense is that he was just following orders. And I think on some level that simply won't wash because, of course, he was indeed involved and in charge of some of the groups that committed some of the atrocities.
Yeah, and worth talking about the irony here in Europe of the fact that it's happening while Russia's accused of war crimes. I suppose where you are in Khartoum, there's the irony of the fact that the number two of the junta is accused of leading the Janjaweed militias in Darfur.
Well, it's more than that. It's the fact that every actor that has taken part to some extent in the conflict in Darfur can now be found at the Sovereign Council, at the head of the country's de facto government after the coup. And so the question of accountability and to what extent the ICC can get cooperation on the other four indictees, to what extent they can get cooperation in terms of finding evidence and interviewing potential witnesses, to bringing those witnesses to The Hague safely, etc. All of these questions are caught up and tied up into the regime and where it stands right now.
For someone like Hemeti, the senior commander inside the junta, is it a case where you have to stay in power or else you'll wind up at The Hague?
I think that is the political calculus for a lot of these generals and also rebels. And we must remember that it's not just those that are indicted by the ICC, but those sort of still hanging around in Khartoum and in parts of Darfur that are also could also be indicted under similar acts. It's I think the problem for them is that they see that staying in power is a way to stave off accountability of any sort, transitional justice, economic or otherwise. But of course, that didn't work for Bashir very well because he was still indicted and he was still imprisoned. There are now doubts as to what extent Bashir will be able to face justice in any court, whether it's in Sudan or in The Hague. And of course, the more that the coup consolidates its power here, the less likely that seems.
And how much coverage is the opening day of the trial getting where you are?
Admittedly, not as much as it should. Considering sort of the landmark status of a trial like this, I would expect it to have much more reverberations in civil society and in other parts of the country. But because under the Bashir regime, the Darfur conflict was so compartmentalized to Darfur, and so Sudan always had and continues to have a centralization problem. Unfortunately, this issue hasn't really reverberated, I think, to the fullest extent it can into Khartoum. Now, will it have an impact on the calculations of the regime? Almost certainly. But I think more engagement with and more engagement by civil society in Sudan writ large, including in Khartoum, is necessary to make sure that events that happened 17 years ago are related to and made relevant by what is happening today in Khartoum and across Sudan.
Yeah, the world's attention's been focused the last couple of years, obviously, on the showdown between a junta that doesn't want to go away and civil society that wants a civilian regime in a democracy in Sudan. How's it playing in Darfur right now?
Well, the thing is that this compartmentalization that I spoke of earlier is no longer the case. The Juba Peace Agreement of 2020 effectively brought Darfuri rebels into the heart of government, and they are now part of the coup regime. So what happens in Darfur directly impacts what happens in Khartoum and vice versa. And what we're seeing today in Darfur, I mean, in many ways, the killings never stopped, the violence never stopped. The land rights issues that were at the core of the Darfur conflict have never been resolved. And so we're still seeing the echoes of the earlier conflicts, but certainly newer conflicts spring up because of those pre-existing unresolved issues. And the transitional government prior to the coup didn't really have the political clout in order to send Bashir to Darfur or talk about lands issues, set up the land commission, etc. And we're seeing sort of the echoes of that inability now, and it doesn't seem likely that those issues will be really looked at with this current government. Just in the last few days, we saw areas of South Darfur face a lot of violence because of the gold mining activities and also land grabbing activities that are directly endorsed by and supported by actors in Khartoum. And that looks set to continue.
That looks set to continue. And before we let you go, Kholood Khair, I have to ask you, the stalemate between those who are still coming out and protesting in the streets and the junta, how's that going?
Well, tomorrow there's a very large protest countrywide that has sort of brought together grievances related to not just transitional justice and economic accountability, but also the very acute economic troubles facing the country right now. The generals have tried to drum up external financing from the Gulf countries, but that's been slow to come in. And so people are really feeling the sort of economic as well as political grievances that had always sped along the revolution. Tomorrow is being earmarked as a really big day, a show of force by the pro-democracy groups to really hit home for the junta that they are not welcome, that they are not wanted, and that they should make way for a full civilian transition.